Two Americans watch the same news report about a naval standoff. One posts about it, shares it, demands the president respond harder. The other scrolls past, trusts diplomats to handle it, goes back to work. Guess which one just made war more likely without realizing it? Everyone believes anxiety protects them from danger. What if I told you your fear is not a shield, but a resource being harvested? Anxious citizens create political conditions where leaders cannot de-escalate. The system does not merely respond to your anxiety. It cultivates it, amplifies it, converts it into political capital. When you feel afraid, you believe you are reacting to threats. But consider this carefully. How many of those threats were presented to you versus discovered by you? What if the way threats are framed determines not just your fear level, but your willingness to accept escalation? If anxiety were truly about protection, it would lead to careful risk assessment. Instead, it typically leads to demands for displays of strength that increase actual danger. Anxiety is not just an emotion in modern democracies. It functions as currency. Politicians compete for your fear because fear translates into votes. A calm electorate evaluates policy on merit. An anxious electorate evaluates policy on perceived strength. When strength becomes the primary metric, compromise appears as weakness. Weakness becomes electoral suicide. Leaders who might prefer negotiation cannot afford to look soft. This dynamic is not accidental. The information environment is structured to maximize anxiety. If you care about understanding how your emotional state influences foreign policy outcomes, consider subscribing to Prof. Jiang Explained. This channel examines how systems convert individual psychology into collective behavior. Share this with someone who wonders why political rhetoric keeps getting more aggressive, even when actual threats remain relatively stable. Think about the 2024 election cycle in the United States. Both parties competed to sound tougher on China. Not because China policy suddenly changed, but because polling showed voters rewarded toughness. Candidates who suggested dialogue or nuance faced attack ads questioning their patriotism. The political incentive was clear: appear strong or lose. This created a ratchet effect where each candidate pushed rhetoric harder. Once in office, that rhetoric becomes constraint. You cannot easily walk back positions you campaigned on. The media ecosystem amplifies this pattern. News outlets compete for attention in a saturated information environment. Anxiety captures attention more effectively than reassurance. A headline reading new tensions with adversary generates more clicks than diplomatic channels remain open. Algorithms learn this pattern and prioritize anxiety-inducing content. You receive a steady stream of threat narratives, not because threats increased, but because threat narratives perform better. Social media compounds the effect dramatically. You see what your network shares. Your network shares content that provokes emotion. Anxiety is highly shareable because it feels important. When you share anxious content, you signal awareness and concern. This creates feedback loops where each share validates the importance of the threat. Within weeks, a minor diplomatic incident becomes a major national humiliation, requiring forceful response. Do you notice how quickly these cycles accelerate during election years? Politicians cannot afford to appear less concerned than their opponents. If one candidate calls a foreign action unacceptable, the other must call it intolerable. If one demands sanctions, the other demands stronger sanctions. The competition for your anxious vote drives policy proposals toward escalation. Candidates rarely ask whether escalation serves strategic interests. This is where the trap closes completely. Once leaders campaign on strength, they govern under constant pressure to demonstrate it. Every foreign policy decision becomes a test. Can they stand firm or will they back down? Media coverage frames negotiations as either victory or capitulation. Nuance dies because nuance does not mobilize your anxiety. You want clear enemies and decisive action. Leaders supply what you demand. But here is what typically goes unexamined in this process. Your anxiety, while feeling protective, often increases actual risk. When leaders cannot compromise without facing domestic political destruction, they choose escalation over flexibility. Escalation feels safer politically even when it is more dangerous strategically. Each escalatory step is justified as necessary to maintain credibility. Credibility with whom? With you, the anxious voter who will punish perceived weakness. Consider how this played out historically before major conflicts. There is usually a period where leaders on both sides feel trapped by domestic opinion. They privately recognize that compromise would prevent catastrophe, but compromise requires political courage that anxious electorates rarely reward. Instead, they select leaders who promise never to back down. These leaders, once in power, cannot back down without betraying the mandate. The economic consequences of this anxiety-driven policy are rarely calculated in advance. When trade relationships fracture due to escalating tensions, you experience it as inflation. When supply chains reorganize around strategic competition, you experience it as shortages. When defense budgets expand to address manufactured urgency, you experience reduced funding for infrastructure. But these costs are diffuse and delayed. The political benefit of appearing strong is immediate. This reveals something uncomfortable about democratic foreign policy in practice. Your emotional state matters more than expert analysis. If strategic analysts conclude that a particular course risks unnecessary escalation, but you demand that course because it feels strong, politicians follow your demand. They are accountable to you, not to strategic coherence. Your anxiety becomes their constraint. They cannot explain complexity when you want certainty. The defense industry understands this dynamic extremely well. Threat inflation serves commercial interests directly. When you feel anxious about foreign adversaries, you support increased military spending. That spending flows to contractors who then fund think tanks that produce reports emphasizing threats. These reports get cited in media coverage that increases your anxiety. The cycle is self-reinforcing and enormously profitable. Political consultants also understand this mechanism intimately. Campaign strategies are built around identifying your anxieties and promising to address them forcefully. Focus groups test which threats resonate most powerfully. Advertising dollars flow toward messages that activate your fear. This is not conspiracy, but professional campaign management. Candidates who refuse to activate your anxiety typically lose. Now think about how this affects diplomatic negotiations in practice. When adversaries observe that American public opinion punishes compromise, they adjust their strategy accordingly. They know American leaders have limited flexibility. This reduces the space for negotiated solutions dramatically. It encourages adversaries to wait out electoral cycles. It makes every negotiation a domestic political spectacle. This is particularly dangerous when both sides face similar domestic pressures. If American leaders cannot compromise without political destruction, and Chinese leaders cannot compromise without political destruction, who compromises? The answer is often no one. Both sides escalate incrementally. Each step is justified as responding to the other. You feel more anxious with each escalation. Your anxiety further constrains your leaders. What makes this especially sophisticated is that your anxiety feels entirely justified. You are not imagining threats. Genuine geopolitical competition exists, but the way you process that competition determines whether it remains manageable or becomes catastrophic. Anxiety shifts your risk calculation fundamentally. Restraint feels like vulnerability. Escalation feels like strength. These feelings, when widely shared, create political incentives that override strategic logic. Intelligence agencies contribute to this dynamic unintentionally but consistently. Their job is to identify threats and warn policymakers. This creates institutional bias toward worst-case scenarios. If they underestimate a threat and something bad happens, they face blame. If they overestimate a threat and nothing happens, they claim their vigilance prevented it. The incentive structure rewards threat inflation systematically. You might believe you are simply staying informed about world events, but information without context is manipulation. When you receive constant updates about adversary military exercises without equivalent updates about routine diplomatic engagement, you develop a skewed threat perception. That skewed perception makes you more likely to support hardline policies. Those policies increase tensions. Increased tensions generate more alarming updates. Another factor is generational memory and its gradual erosion. Americans who lived through the Cold War carry visceral caution about nuclear escalation. As that generation ages, younger voters lack the same emotional anchor. They evaluate geopolitical risk more abstractly. This can actually increase support for aggressive policies because the catastrophic downside feels theoretical. Your anxiety, untempered by historical memory, becomes easier to weaponize. Economic anxiety compounds geopolitical anxiety in predictable ways. When you feel economically insecure, external enemies provide simple explanations. Manufacturing job losses get attributed to unfair foreign competition rather than automation. This attribution is politically convenient because it suggests an external enemy can be confronted. The actual sources of economic anxiety are complex, but complexity does not mobilize voters. This is how your personal economic anxiety gets converted into geopolitical hostility. Politicians promise to get tough on trade, to bring jobs back, to stand up to adversaries who supposedly caused your economic pain. These promises rarely address the actual structural causes, but they provide emotional satisfaction. You feel heard. You reward politicians who validate your anxiety. Those politicians then govern under pressure to deliver. The psychological mechanism is straightforward and well documented. Anxiety seeks release. Political action provides release. Voting for candidates who promise strength feels like doing something about the threat. This emotional release is powerful, even when the policy outcome increases actual danger. You feel better having taken action. The system depends on that feeling. Now consider how this affects your daily media consumption patterns. Every notification about international tensions triggers mild anxiety. That anxiety keeps you engaged. Engagement generates advertising revenue. Platforms optimize for engagement, which means optimizing for anxiety. You are not the customer. You are the product. Your anxiety is being sold. The geopolitical content is simply the delivery mechanism. This explains why de-escalation rarely trends on social media platforms. Resolution does not generate the same engagement as escalation. When diplomatic breakthroughs happen, they receive minimal coverage. When talks break down, coverage intensifies. You learn to associate international relations with failure and danger. Success, when it occurs, seems invisible. This creates a perception that diplomacy never works. The tragedy is that your anxiety, while understandable, often produces the opposite of safety. Leaders selected for projecting strength are not necessarily skilled at managing complex geopolitical risk. They are skilled at winning elections in anxiety-driven environments. Once in power, they face pressure to continue projecting strength. This can mean prioritizing symbolic victories over strategic stability. And here is the final mechanism that makes this system so durable. When escalation occurs, it validates your initial anxiety. You feel vindicated. The threat was real. Your concern was justified. This makes you more anxious about future threats, more willing to reward political strength, more suspicious of diplomatic nuance. The system has converted your anxiety into a renewable resource. You are not merely observing geopolitics from a safe distance. You are participating in it. Your emotional state influences which leaders get elected. Your media consumption habits shape what information gets prioritized. Your voting patterns determine which foreign policy approaches are politically viable. The system does not control you directly, but it is structured to harvest your anxiety. The first domino is not in Beijing or Moscow. It is in your newsfeed, in your social media algorithm, in your emotional reaction to carefully curated information. When you feel anxious and demand strength, you are not protecting yourself. You are creating political conditions where leaders cannot easily choose restraint. Your anxiety becomes their constraint. If you want to understand how conflicts actually start, stop looking only at foreign capitals. Look at domestic opinion in major powers. Look at how anxiety travels through information ecosystems. Look at how politicians respond to that anxiety. Look at how your own emotional state contributes to political incentives. The next major conflict, if it comes, will not begin because leaders were evil. It will begin because anxious electorates demanded strength. The question is not whether you should be concerned about geopolitical competition. The question is whether your anxiety is producing the security you seek or undermining it. And the uncomfortable answer is that widespread anxiety typically makes everyone less safe. It creates political environments where prudent leaders cannot survive. It converts complex strategic problems into simple emotional narratives. You believed your anxiety was protecting you. What if it has been protecting the system that benefits from keeping you anxious? Share this analysis if you think someone needs to understand how their emotional state shapes the political incentives that determine whether leaders can choose peace over escalation.